All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for Tafshin Pei, our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilsim Mishpacha of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all of the Sherman Drushos this year in the Schutz of Besoros Tavos for all of Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan, Paul Pollack, in celebration of the Nisan birthdays of his wife Kathy, granddaughter Tikva Esther, and the birth of a grandson, Eden Jeremiah Pollack of Indianapolis, Indiana. Anonymous Talmud Torah sponsorship in the schus of Simchas for all of our children, and for Nisan to be the month of Geula Shleima for all of Klal Yisrael. Amen. And Avram Shindi Kelman in memory of Avram's mother, Sarah Brina Bas Yoshua Heschel, Zichron Lebrach. We obtain the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families Ein Nechama, all those who need a refuah Shev, and together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, Kadosh Baruch Hu Shem Yeretz Hashem, bring home our hostages b'shalom and b'karov, and should allow our holy soldiers to be successful b'chol ma'aseh yedehem. With that, let us begin. A lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Great daf ahead of us. Today's daf is daf Tes 8. We are picking up Emirat Hashem on Ches Amud Beis 8b, and we left off yesterday, I believe, Ben Gola Al Yidei Av. Is that correct? 2 dots. Okay, so we are picking up 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 lines up from the bottom. Ben Gola Al Yidei Av. So literally translated is that if the son kills the father accidentally, the son is sent to Galus based on the death of his father. Says the Gemara, Mini, Mary Zakasha, Makin Nefesh, Pratla Maki Aviv. Pasuk says if a person kills someone, this comes to exclude, or a person hits someone, strikes someone, this comes to exclude one who goes ahead and strikes his father. Now both say, now here, the Bazik is talking about it. So again, this comes to exclude one's father. So again, that contradicts the Mishnah. Thank you, David. Comes a contradiction to the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, Amrav kind of lo kasha. It's not a contradiction. Yeah, I'll drink it. No, it's all right. Thank you. Thank you. So Amrav kind of lo kasha. Rabbi Shimon v'harabanan. The Gemara says it's not a contradiction. 2 different opinions. One is Rabbi Shimon and one is the Rabbanan. Now, what's this machlokis over here? If you take a look at Rashi, this is actually quite interesting. Rashi says over here, Rabbi Shimon Rabbanan. So actually, let's read the rest of the Gemara first. Then we'll go to Rashi. Rabbi Shimon Damar Chenek Chamar Misa. Actually, no. Let's read Rashi. Good. Rashi will say is in the wide lines, 3rd line down in. Rabbi Shimon Damar. Listen to this. A little Chazar of Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin beparak dalad misos Chenek Chamar Misayif. So according to Rabbi Shimon, remember also we had this whole machlokes about in the Arba Misos Beis Din, which is considered to be more Chamar, which is considered to be more Kal. So according to Rabbi Shimon, Chenek, which is strangulation, is considered to be more chamer, more stringent than sayif, which is beheading. Okay, now watch this. Now again, according to Rabbi Shimon, if a person, a son, chas v'shalom, kills his father, the penalty ultimately is chenek. The penalty is strangulation. That's in a general case. Disnan, mishin is chayiv beis misos beis din, nidon bechamura. Vahorik aviv chayiv shtei misos, sha'osa chabura ba'avim min ha'nechnokin hein, va'makin nefesh min ha'neheragin. So I'll say, this is very interesting. Technically speaking, if a person goes ahead and chas v'shalom kills his father, he's really chayiv 2 death penalties. Why? One for striking his father, and then one for killing his father. Now, interestingly enough, the halacha is that if a person strikes his father, that's chenek. And in general, when you go and you kill someone, that's hereg. That's hereg, right? Beheading. So now, v'kan yesh chaburas aviv uritzicha. So now, right, a person kills his father. There's 2 penalties involved over here. There's chabura, which is chenek, and then there's killing someone. There's killing someone, which is hereg, which the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon Damar Chenek Chamar Im Haya Ze Mezid Haya Bechenek. Now again, according to Rabbi Shimon says that Chenek is more Chamar. Therefore, again, had the son killed his father intentionally, he would be subject to Chenek Va'achshav Shu Shogeg Lo Nitna Shigagasa Lekapara Begalus Im Nitna Torah Kapara Shigagas Sayif Shikala Lo Nitna Kapara Shigagas Chenek. So this is very interesting. So now, remember, the whole concept of galus, is that galus is a kapara. Now, even kapara, as we've seen, has its limitations, right? You can't be mechaper for everything. So Rabbi Shimon hold like this. So in general, galus is mechaper for lower forms of misa, like sayif, like hereg, but chenek, which is considered to be a more chamer form of misa, so ultimately galus is not mechaper for that. So according to Rabbi Shimon, who holds that you would normally get chenek for even just injuring a parent, holds that galus cannot be mechaper for that. Galus cannot be mechaper for that. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that ultimately if a son kills his father, ultimately he does not go to galus, because the death penalty that he is liable to is chenek. Chenek is too severe to be atoned for through galus. That's Rabbi Shimon. Back to the Gemara. So Rabbi Shimon damar chenek chamer misayif. According to Rabbi Shimon, holds that chenek, which is the penalty you get for killing your father, is more chamer than sayif, which is the general penalty one gets for taking a life. Shigagas sayif. I'm reading the Gemara now. Shigagas sayif nit lakapara. Shigagas chenek lo nit lakapara. So again, a shogeg that involves a sayif penalty can be atoned for, but a shogeg that involves a chenek penalty, i.e. striking or killing one's father, galus cannot be mechaper for. Therefore, the position of Rabbi Shimon is that if a son accidentally kills his father, the son does not go to galus. That's the opinion reflected in the brisa that the Gemara just quoted. On the other hand, our Mishnah, which says that a son does go to galus for killing his father, whose opinion is that? That's the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan, the Amri Sayif Chamer Mechanek. So according to the Rabbanan, who hold that Sayif, remember again, Sayif, beheading, is the general penalty you get when you kill someone. So the Rabbanan hold that Sayif is more Chamer than Chenek. Therefore what? Therefore, Horik Avid B'Shogeg Shigaga Sayifu, V'Shigaga Sayif Nitna Lakapara. So Rabbi said this is very interesting. So according to the Rabbanan will say Stam, Chenek, right, or I should say Sayif is more chamer than Chenek. So therefore, again, the fact that galus is mechaper for Sayif, it's certainly mechaper for Chenek, and therefore, according to the Rabbanan, a son would go to galus if he accidentally killed his father. So the Rabbanan is the position mentioned in our Mishnah, and Rabbi Shimon is the position mentioned in our Brisa. So I'll say it's very interesting just to see how all roads lead back to this machlokes in Sanhedrin, which is considered to be the more chamer form of misa. According to Rabbi Shimon, chenek is more chamer. According to the Rabbanan, sayif is more chamer. Why does this make a difference? Because in general, when you kill someone, you chayiv sayif. Accidentally kill someone, you chayiv sayif. Therefore, again, if galus can be mechaper for sayif, according to the Rabbanan, if it can be mechaper for sayif, which is more chamer, it can still be mechaper for chenek, which is more kal. According to Rabbi Shimon, sayif is more kal. Galus takes care of sayif. Galus does not take care ultimately again of chenek, and that's machlokes. So both say so. Therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, our Mishnah reflects the view of the Rabbanan that if a son accidentally kills his father, a son is sent to galus. And Rabbi say that is how he paskin. That is how he paskin. He paskin if a son accidentally kills his father, the son is subject to the laws of galus. Rabbi say there's a tremendous Mr. Haskell on this also, which shows you something fascinating, which is galus is a kapara. Right? Galus, the whole idea of being exiled is atonement. It's important to understand, even kapara has its limitations, which is really fascinating to think about, right? We like to think that forgiveness knows no boundaries. Atonement knows no boundaries. It's not true. There are boundaries. There are certain things that if you do, right, ultimately, again, you've passed a line, and atonement is not possible. Now, again, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's possible that atonement and forgiveness is boundless. But in the realm of man, right, in the realm of interpersonal relationships, there are certain lines that you cross that you cannot rebound from. You can't come back from it. So it's fascinating even to see that even galus, which is a form of kapara, it can be mechaper for a wide swath of things. But there is a certain point where if you go too far, you can't. And this is incredibly important, I will say, because this is why we must take heed and we must take so much care in our interpersonal relationships, right? We all have situations like this. I think this often happens much more from men towards women than women towards men, which is you do something. Let's just call it to your spouse. You do something. And what happens? You recognize that you're wrong. And you have enough courage to admit that you're wrong. So you go over to your spouse and you apologize. Now, what's interesting to note is men, and this is interesting, Chashbar Baruch Hu wired us, we make the assumption that if you apologize sincerely, what should happen next? All is forgiven. Right? It's sincere. Like there's even like a little tear coming out of the side of my eye, right? It's sincere. And then sometimes like a person is shocked when the apology is not just automatically accepted, or even if it's accepted, like it just doesn't reset the clock. I will say it's very important to understand this is how human relationships work. When you do certain things wrong, sometimes you pass a certain point where the forgiveness cannot be automatically granted or will not be automatically granted. It might be at some point later on, maybe not. So even kapara, right? Even atonement, it has its limitations. You can't atone for everything. You can't make up for everything. You can't achieve forgiveness in the realm of interpersonal relationships for everything. With the Kadosh Baruch Hu, it's different. That's right. Right? Yom Kippur also, right? Even Yom Kippur, right? Again, Kadosh Baruch Hu can wipe the slate clean for everything. When it comes to relationships with each other, that you got to figure out. It's incredibly important. This is why we have to take, I'm mentioning this now because especially like over Yom Tiv, we end up spending a lot of time with family. And sometimes, although it's wonderful to spend a lot of time with family, sometimes, again, it can be a little bit of a setup for certain relationship showdowns. And it is important for us to exercise incredible heed and caution, how we treat our spouses, how we treat our loved ones, how we treat our relatives. Because, bless you, because although it's nice to think that no matter what you do, it could be forgiven, it's not true. Sometimes in relationships, there is a certain point where if you go too far, forgiveness ultimately, again, is not attainable. So the Gemara goes weiter. Even kapara has its limitations. Rava says, Prat la'ose chabura ba'avev b'shogeg. So this is very interesting. Rava understands over here, Rava understands that halacha l'maisa is actually not talking about killing your father, or killing one's father. Rather, what is it talking about? Someone who inflicts a wound upon his father b'shogeg. Right? So remember again, generally, even if a son injures his father, son hits his father, that's a chiyuv misa. What happens if a son injures his father accidentally? So the Gemara says, I might have thought, this is the interesting havamina, I would have thought that since if a son intentionally injures his father, there's a chiyuv misa. Maybe if he unintentionally injures his father, what should be the halacha? Galus. Kamash malon? No. Kamash malon, that there is no galus. There's no galus in that type of situation. If a son accidentally injures his father, ultimately, again, he's pater from misa. He may be chayv in damages, right? Because adamu li'olam, you're always chayv in damages, even if you inflict them accidentally. But Lamai said there's no galus for accidentally injuring one's father. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Hakol golden aidei Yisrael. So the Gemara said everyone, literally translated, everyone is exiled through Yisrael, which makes it sound like anyone who kills a Jew is subject to galus. So it says the Gemara, Hakol golden aidei Yisrael lasuyei mai, who or what does this come to include? So the Gemara says, Lasuye Eved Vekusi. It's coming to include an Eved. Now, both say, remember, whenever we see an Eved means Eved Kinani, right? And a Kusi. And I both say, what's unique about Eved Kinani? What's unique about Eved Kinani? So in general, whenever there are only two groups of people who could be partially Jewish, right? Celebrities and Eved Kinani, right? So it's interesting. Generally, right? You can't be part Jewish. Either, right? Either you're in or you're out. So what's interesting is the exception to that rule is actually Eved Kinani, because remember again, a Jew acquires an Eved Kinani. He has milah and tevila l'shem avlos, a circumcision and immersion in mikvah for the sake of being an Eved. That essentially gives him the obligations like an Isha, like a woman. Then upon emancipation, he becomes a full-fledged Jew. So it's interesting, he is quasi-Jewish. Right? And a Kusi. Now remember again, we'll say Kusim. So remember, we use Kusim a little bit in different ways in different contexts. Kusi sometimes can be synonymous with Akum. But remember, Kusim, we know again in their real categorical designation, were these group of individuals from, surprisingly enough, Kusa, right, who converted, resettled in Eretz Yisrael by Shalmaneser, the king of Ashur. They were idolaters. There was an outbreak of lions in Eretz Yisrael because of their idolatry. They converted. But there's a homachlokes whether or not their conversion was legitimate or not. So the Gemara says, who are we talking about over here? An Eved and a Kusi. Watch this. So the Gemara says, Tanin l'hadatan Rabbana. Listen to this. Eved v'Kusi, gola v'loka aidei Yisrael. An Eved and a Kusi are exiled and lashed through a Yisrael, based on what they do to a Jew. Now, what does this mean? The Yisrael go leveloka al yidei kusi ve'eved, and a Yisrael ultimately is exiled and flogged based on a kusi and an eved. What does this mean? So bishlam kusi ve'eved golai de yisra v'loke. So listen to this. I understand how an eved and a kusi could be gola al yidei yisra v'loke. Listen to this. Gola the katle. So for example, if an eved or a kusi killed a Jew accidentally, they could be sent to galus, right? And v'loke, what's the case of v'loke? When would they get flogged? The lache, if they cursed the Jew. So if an eved or a kusi accidentally killed the Jew, they could be sent to galus. And if they curse a Jew, they could be flogged. Ali Yisrael gola v'loka de kusi. But I understand what's the case of Yisrael being gola v'loka, exiled and flogged based on a kusi. So bishlama gola, I can understand the case of galus. When could galus come up? The katle. Let's say a Jew accidentally killed a kusi. Okay, so I can see that maybe he's exiled for that. Elaloke amai delache. So if you want to say when would he be flogged? Maybe he'd be flogged ultimately if he cursed the kusi. Here's the problem with that. The pasuk says, "V'nasi ba'amcha losar ba'osem mase amcha." The only time you're obligated for cursing someone is if they fit into the category of amcha. Amcha, your nation. And I will say, what's the definition of your nation? Osem mase amcha, where they follow the dictates of Yiddishkeit. But Bepashtos, again, a kusi is not. So why would I be obligated for cursing him? Interesting. The case might be where, let's say, again, I testified against the kusi, then I was made into an eid zomim. I can get Makkos for that. But here's the issue. Is there a parallel case by an eved? Because if you were to testify by an eved and then be made into an eid zomim, eved bar eidusu, is an eved even subject to the laws of eidus? What's the case? Kigon sheiko haka, top of test, shein ba shava pruta. Very interesting. The case could very well be where I injured the kusi, or the eved for that matter, and injured them in a way with an injury that doesn't result in injuries of a pruta. So we'll say, what happens if you injure someone? This is actually interesting. I injure someone, but the injury does not amount to a shava pruta. So remember again, in the world of damages, if it's less than a shava pruta, then what are you chayiv? Nothing. But listen to this. Rashi says over here, top Rashi Tessamond Aleph, she'ein bo shava pruta, she'myesh ba tashlumei pruta mishalim ve'ein aloke, di'afinim be'ksuv v'sveilin aris. So it says, very interesting. So the halacha is, be'perush rib satorah chova b'chaver tashlumim v'che'ein bo shava pruta loke, sha'avra alosep. Listen to this. So there's an interesting halacha, by the way, just an aside. We're always, right, if you injure someone and it's less than a shava pruta, there could be no liability for damages, but you'll get Makkos. You get Makkos, right? Which I will say, by the way, makes sense from the perspective of societal order, right? In other words, that you can't just go around injuring people, and even if there's not financial liability for it, you can't do it. There's got to be some level of liability. So the case could be where I injured the eved of the kusi, less than a shava pruta, where I'll get Makkos. If you injured him with a hakal less than a shava pruta, ultimately again you get Makkos. And we won't go ahead and equate injuring with cursing. In other words, two separate set of halachas. Just because there might be liability for injuring doesn't mean there will be liability for cursing. Okay, chutz mi al yidei ger toshav. So we'll say. So this is interesting. So the Mishnah said, except by ger toshav, right? It said v'yisah golin al yideihen chutz mi ger toshav. The ger toshav eino gola al yidei ger toshav. Now remember again, who's the ger toshav? The ger toshav is a guy, right? He's a non-Jew who lives in Eretz Yisrael and essentially accepts all Sheva mitzvos b'nei Noach. Okay, so the Gemara says, Alma ger toshav oved kochavim hu. Now, obviously, the fact that it sounds like that a Jew is not exiled because of the ger toshav sounds like the ger toshav has the din of an akum, of a non-Jew. So the Gemara says, Ema seifa, but look at the end of the Mishnah. Ger toshav gola al yidei ger toshav. So it sounds like if your ger toshav kills another ger toshav, he would be sent to galus. So the Gemara says, so what's going on over here? Amar Rav Kana lo kasha, kan beger toshav shara ger toshav, kan beger toshav shahara Yisrael. One is talking about a case of a ger toshav who killed another ger toshav. That gets galus. But the other case is a case of a ger toshav who kills a Jew who does not get galus. Now, both say, now this is very interesting. This goes to what we said before. Galus, what is galus? Galus is a kapara. It's an atonement. Now remember again, in order for atonement to work, the sin itself could only be up to a certain level of severity. If it goes beyond the severity threshold, then galus can't work. So therefore, when one ger toshav kills another ger toshav, it's subject to galus. But if a ger toshav kills a Jew, even accidentally, that act is of such great severity that it is too great to be atoned for through galus, right? We kind of look at not going to galus as like, you're getting off, right? You're getting off. You're not being held liable. It's the opposite, right? When you don't get galus, it means that the act has risen to such a level of severity that it cannot be atoned simply through galus. So look at Rashi just a moment. Rashi says, Ger Toshav, it's right across in Rashi, Ger Toshav, Shar Ger Toshav, Gola, Kidiktani Behedja, Bereisha Kishar Gesisra, Ena Gola Delo Sagile Begalus. So therefore, again, the way the Gemara seems to be resolving is like this. If a Ger Toshav kills a Ger Toshav, he goes to galus. But if a Ger Toshav kills a Jew, he does not go to galus because that act is too great to be atoned for through galus. Incredible. So others frame this conversation in a different way, contrasting psukim. Listen to this. Ksiv, Libnei Yisrael, v'lager v'latoshav b'socham, tiena sheish sha'arim. So we'll say, see, remember, here's what's interesting. The pasuk explicitly says, right, Libnei Yisrael, right, for the ger, and the toshav who lives in their midst, these 6 cities. Now, which 6 cities are we talking about? Darei Mikla. It's actually our next Mishnah, or 2 Mishnah, I assume now. No Mishnah, 2 Mishnahs from now, right? So we'll talk about the 6 cities. So interestingly enough, what do you see from this pasuk? The ger toshav is included in the halachos of Ir Miklat, right? He's mentioned here explicitly. So the Gemara says, listen to this. But then the pasuk says, these cities will be for you. Lachem v'lo l'gerim. For you and not for gerim. Now, both say gerim obviously in this context doesn't mean what? Doesn't mean converts, right? Because a convert is a regular Jew. It means ger toshav. So which one is it? Are the Ari Miklat for ger toshav or not for ger toshav? What's going on? Amrav Kana, lo kashya. Kan be ger toshav shahara Yisrael. Kan be ger toshav shahara ger toshav. Oh, it all depends who you're killing. It's good to know, right? It all depends who you're killing in life, right? So in other words, again, if a ger toshav is killing another ger toshav, then Ir Miklat. If a ger toshav is killing a Jew, no Ir Miklat. Okay. So our minu, the Gemara is a kasha lefichach, ger va'ovikocham shahargu neharagim. Listen to this. So the Gemara says, Raminu, Gemara is a kasha. Ger va'ovikocham shahargu. Right? So if a ger and an oved kochavim killed, neharagim. Ultimately, again, they're killed. So the Gemara said, here, what's interesting about this? What's interesting is we're putting ger and akum in the same sentence. Now, once again, I'll say ger in this context always means what? Ger toshav. Because remember, again, when it comes to the halachos of killing, so accidental killing, right? So what does it matter if a person converted, a person is born Jewish? It makes absolutely no difference. A Jew is a Jew. So the Maisa, it's interesting to note over here that the ger and the oved kochavim are put together. So ger va'oved kochavim shahargu neheragim. Katani ger dumya to oved kochavim. Now I will say the Torah sounds like the pasuk, not the pasuk. The Brisa is equating a ger to an oved kochavim. How so? Ma oved kochavim loshna the katal barminei loshna the katal la barminei nerag. Just like an akum Rabosai, whether the akum killed someone like him or killed someone who's not like him. In other words, whether another oved kochavim or a Jew, what's the halacha? Katal, right? He's killed. Right, he killed a ben Noach is executed even for accidental murder. Af ger loshna de katal barminei v'loshna de katal la barminei nerag. So it sounds like we're equating the halacha of the ger toshav with an akum. So what's going on over here? So it sounds like a ger toshav is not subject to galus at all. So amrav chista lo kashya. Listen to this. Kan shahargu derech yirida. Kan shahargu derech aliyah. Oh, very interesting. So the Gemara wants to make a distinction. Maybe it matters how the ger toshav is killing. So again, if he kills derech yirida, or is in a downward motion, that's shogeg, may be subject to galus. If he kills derech aliyah, that's not considered to be the paradigmatic case of shogeg, and therefore what? Not subject to galus, rather to execution. Derech yirida, the Yisrael gali, ihu nami sagile begalus. So just like a Jew, right? So in this respect, a ger toshav is somewhat similar to a Jew. Just like a Jew goes to galus when he kills someone derech yirida, so too if the ger toshav kills another ger toshav derech yirida, he'll go to galus. On the other hand, derech aliyah, the Yisrael pater, derech aliyah, where Yisrael is pater. Now remember again, I both say, if a Jew kills someone derech aliyah, remember again, we had all these cases, he's lifting the bucket, right? And the rope snaps and it falls down. Or he's pulling the roller up and it falls down and kills someone. The Jew doesn't go to Galus in those circumstances. In those circumstances, hu nerag, a ger toshav would be executed. Okay, Amar le Rava. So Rava wants to suggest the following. So we'll say, so therefore, what it sounds like what the Gemara is saying is like this: is a ger toshav is subject to galus when he kills another ger toshav, not subject to galus when he kills a Jew. Furthermore, a ger toshav is only subject to galus if he kills derech yirida, but if he kills derech aliyah, then ultimately he's executed like an akum, who is held liable for any act of bloodshed as well. Amalei Rava, v'lav kavachomer, Rava isn't a kavachomer, umad derech yirida di yisrael gali ihu nami sagile begalus. So right, ultimately again with derech yirida, where a Jew goes to galus, so certainly again a ger toshav will go to galus as well. Derech aliyah di yisrael pater ihu nerag. Does it make sense to say that derech aliyah, where a Jew is pater from galus, that a ger toshav is executed? Does that make sense? Ela amarava, this is fascinating. Ela amarava ba'omer mutter. What's the case over here, Bosai? The case over here is omer mutter. What's omer mutter? Rashi says over here, nerag delav bar galusu. What are we talking about over here? A ger toshav who thinks it's permitted to take a life. Omer mutter. He didn't know. He didn't know the halacha. He thought it was permitted to go in and kill someone. That's called omer mutter. So Rava wants to suggest that ultimately, again, a ger toshav who kills someone in the context of omer mutter ultimately is put to death. Is executed. Only Abaye omer mutter anasu. But omer mutter, that would be ones. No, wouldn't that be ones? In other words, if a person thinks that it's permitted to go ahead and take a life, wouldn't that be a case of ones, extenuating circumstances? To which the Gemara says, Amalei Shani Omer Mutter Karov Lemezidhu. No, but say Rava holds, I hold that Omer Mutter is Karov Lemezid. Karov Lemezid. That ultimately, again, this is not considered to be ones, but rather ultimately, again, this is Karov Lemezid. Now, we'll say, now, again, so let's see. They go according to their reasoning. The Itmar, Kasavar Beimavanim Sa'adam, supposed to listen to this. Let's say a ger toshav is out hunting. He thinks he sees an animal. Right? But he accidentally kills a person. In other words, it turns out that it wasn't an animal, it was a person. And Shabbos says, shows you something amazing. Shows you how low a person could sink if they could be mistaken for an animal. Right? Sometimes a person could debase themselves to such a level that they're mistaken for a behema. So kasar behema v'nimsa adam, kanani v'nimsa ger toshav, or again, he thought it was a non-Jew, but it turned out to be a ger toshav. What's talach in these cases? So I will say, so interestingly enough, in these cases, the ger toshav killed, there was intention to take life. He just thought it was what? A different life. In case one, he thought it was an animal, turned out to be a person. Case two, he thought it was an akum, turned out to be another ger toshav. So what's halacha? Rava Amar Chayiv. Rava says you're chayiv. The ger toshav is chayiv. This is why. Omer mutter karov lemezidhu. Because just because you think something is mutter, right, that borders on mezid. That borders on mezid. Rav Chisda says potter. Rav Chisda on the other hand says that halacha l'maisa again, potter. Why Omer Mutter Anasu? Ultimately, again, he holds that Omer Mutter ultimately again is ones. So I'll say, by the way, it's such a fascinating machlokes, right? Which has tremendous hashkafic implications as well. What's Omer Mutter? What's Omer Mutter? Omer Mutter essentially is really one of two cases. Either a person thought things were a certain way, but did not take the time to clarify what the actual circumstances were, or a person literally lacked knowledge, but did not take the necessary steps to clarify or to gain that knowledge. So what is that? What is that in life? I will say, no, this happens all the time to us, right? Omer Mutter. I did something because I didn't take the time to clarify what the actual circumstances were. Or I did something and I did not know what I did was prohibited. And now after the fact, what is my level of liability for not having taken the necessary steps to clarify the circumstances or to gain the requisite knowledge to operate properly? What is my liability? So it's machlokes, right? Rav Chisda says, okay, it's ones, it's karov la'ones, right? What are you going to do? Right? There wasn't intentionality to do anything terrible. It's karov la'ones. So obviously, what are you talking about? That's karov lemezid. You should have been more. Why not take the time in life to clarify your circumstances? Why not take the time in life to acquire the necessary knowledge you need to operate properly? And failure to do so, don't say ones. Don't say ones. Don't cry extenuating circumstances. I didn't take the time to clarify the circumstances around me. I didn't take the time to acquire the necessary knowledge. That's a failure on my part. That's a failure on my part. Okay, is it mazid? Okay, no, it's not going to rise to mazid, but you know what? It's karav l'mazid. It's karav l'mazid. And I will say, I think we would all agree, we'll see what the halacha l'maisa is, but hashkafa l'maisa is omer mutter, is absolutely karav l'mazid. Omer mutter, failure to clarify the circumstances around me and acting without that clarity, or acting without taking the time to acquire proper knowledge and proper tools to make informed decisions, and then making poor decisions or acting in a wrongful fashion, hashkafa l'maisa, I am liable for that. I am absolutely liable for that, right? Adam muad li'olam. I am responsible to clarify circumstances before I make decisions. And I am responsible to acquire the necessary knowledge to lead an informed life. And failure to do so, I will say, that's on me. That's on me. Halacha l'maisa, we'll see in a little bit. Says Gavaiter, says the Gemara, Eisei, Rav Chisda, so Rav is the Kash Rav Chisda, Hincha meis ali isha shalakachtas, listen to this, Avimelech. Remember again about the story of Avimelech. Avraham Avinu goes to Gerar, and remember again when he goes to Gerar, he says to Avimelech, she says to Sarah, Imrina achosia, tell them that you're my sister. Right? So what happens? Avimelech goes out and takes Sarah, and then the whole household is stricken by a terrible plague. And then Kadosh Baruch Hu says to Avimelech, Hincha meis al isha shalakachta. You are going to be executed, right? You're going to be killed because of this married woman that you took. So the Gemara says, Ma'ila b'dei shamayim. Does it not mean ultimately again that halacha l'maisa is going to be executed by heaven? Now remember again, Avimelech is a case of Omer Mutter. Omer Mutter, right? He thought that she was Avram's sister, and therefore again she was eligible. She was eligible. To which the Gemara says, no. My love be the Adam. So does this not show us that a Ben Noach is held accountable by Omer Mutter? Right? He literally again, Avimelech is going to be executed. Lo b'dei shamayim. No. Hashem is saying, Avimelech, in a court of law, you would not be found guilty because Lamais again, Omer Mutter is karav la'ones. But klape shmayim, Yahzeva Kadosh Baruch Hu, you would absolutely be held liable. Tegenami dichsev mechato li. Kadosh Baruch Hu phrases it as Avimelech, you're sinning towards me. Towards me, or using this logic, if chatasi le'elokim, when it says chatasi le'elokim, I will say now again, this is by Yosef. This is by Yosef, right? When Eshes Potiphar is trying to seduce him, and Yosef essentially says to her, how can I do this? If I do this, v'chatasi le'elokim. So the Gemara says, le'elokim v'lo Adam. So would Yosef be committing a crime just to God and not against? No, it was adultery. It was adultery again. So it would have been a crime punishable again in a human court of law as well. Eladino masr the Adam. Rather, again, what you have to say is, as much as Yosef was saying that I'd be sinning against God, it would be against God, but it would also be a din that would be handed over to a human court. Hachenami dino masr la Adam. So to over here, Avimelech's din would have also been handed over to a human court. So what do you see from here, according to Rabbi? What do you see from here? That Omer Mutter is karav l'mezid, right? That ultimately, just because someone thinks something is mutter, nevertheless, Omer Mutter is almost rises to the level of intentionality. Seis ve'abai l'Rava, Sabai is the kasha to Rava, Hagoy gam tzadik tarog. So ultimately, Avimelech says back, ultimately again to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He says, are you going to go ahead and just kill an innocent person? So it sounds like a person. Now remember, ultimately Hashem forgives Avimelech, which makes it sound like God agreed with Avimelech that Omer Mutter is karav la'ones. Hasam kida kama hadri iluya, va'ata hashev eshes ha'ish ki navihu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Avimelech, return Sarah. So here's what's interesting. Kadosh Baruch Hu, Rashi points out over here, Lo hodol dvarav shev shelo tshuva shechayim nisa sheno tzadik b'davar shaylo lilmod derech eretz v'farsh. So we're going to see that Hashem did not agree with Avimelech. Right? Avimelech wanted to portray himself as a victim. Right? I'm a victim in this. After all, again, they conspired. Right? They both said, "She's my sister." What was I to do? Kadosh Baruch Hu says, "You're not innocent. You're not innocent. Maybe right? Maybe Omer Mutter is not Karov Lamezin, maybe so, but Lamaisa, still you're not putter, you're not innocent over here. Why not? So this is very interesting. So Hashem says to Avimelech, return Sarah to Avram, because Avram is a Navi. Amud Beis. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Eishes Navi hu titihadar. The lav navi lo tadar. I don't understand. So you have to return a man's wife because he's a prophet, and if he's not a prophet, you don't have to return his wife. This is what Hashem said to Avimelech. V'ata hashev es eishes haish mikal makom. Right? Avimelech, return Sarah to her husband because she's a married woman. That's it. Period. I vidkamrit hagoy gam tzadik tarog. So maybe Avimelech, now you're going to play like the victim card, right? You're going to say, right, you're the victim, right? Everybody says it's incredible, right? Avimelech, see, it's not just in 2025 that everybody's a victim, right? Others will say, Avimelech, you're the victim, you're the victim, you're not the victim. You're not the victim. Because after all, again, Avram said to me, that Sarah is my sister. Do you know why Avram said to you, is my sister? She's my sister? Navihu. Because Avram Avinu is a very smart man. Avram Avinu is a prophet. And he understood how things were working here in your kehila. Right? He understood how things are happening over here in your community. Why, what happened? He understood from your behavior how he had to operate. So I'll say, when someone shows up in the city, right? Al iske achilo shtiya sholin also, klum sholin also ishtechazu achos chazu. You know what I'll say? When somebody shows up in town, right, and they're standing next to a woman, right, generally, what's the question you ask them, right? You ask a guest, do you have a place to sleep? Do you have a place to eat? If the first question you ask them is, hey, who's she? Right? Is that your wife or your sister? Right? Generally, again, it does not portend well for the particular community. So Avram Avinu being a Navi, and I will say in this context, being a Navi means he was an insightful individual. So he understood already, again, coming into Gerar, that this was a place of incredible immorality, and that they would have possibly killed Avram and Sarah had they recognized that ultimately, again, she was his wife. So because he was a Navi, therefore he acted in a certain way. But Avimelech, ultimately, again, the fact that these were the questions that he was asked when he came down to Gerar is in and of itself an indictment of you and your community. So don't play the victim card, right? Don't play the victim card. Shekain mikan sheben Noach nerag shalom od v'lo lamad. So what do you see from here? So ultimately, again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu rejects Avimelech's claim of Omer Mutter, right? He rejects his claim. He rejects things. Avimelech, you are liable. Okay, I'm not going to kill you because I recognize that you did not act intentionally. But please understand that at the end of the day, a Ben Noach is held liable for Omer Mutter. We'll say that it's halacha l'maisa. That's how the Gemara ends off. Right? That a Ben Noach who thinks that something is mutter and therefore operates in that way, he should have learned. Right? He should have clarified his circumstances. He should have learned what is not. And failure to clarify your circumstances, failure to clarify and learn ultimately results in liability and culpability. Incredible. Says the Mishnah. Hasuma in a gola. So this is a very interesting case. A blind person is not exiled. Right? So the Pashtos, what this is talking about over here is that a blind person kills someone, right? Accidentally kills someone. He is not sent into Galus. Rabbi Yehuda, right? Rabbi Yehuda says, yes, he is killed. He's exiled. He's exiled. Quite interesting. Hasone in a gola. So listen to this. Let's say Reuven accidentally kills Shimon. But Reuven and Shimon are bitter enemies. So what's the halacha? Tanakama says Reuven is not exiled. Rabbi Yossi says Hasone nerag mipneshu kamuan. Now here's interesting. According to Tanakama, the Sone, right, the enemy, right? Reuven and Shimon are enemies. Reuven accidentally kills Shimon. So Tanakama says Reuven's not going to go to Galus, but we're also not going to do anything else to him. Right? We're not going to do anything else to him. On the other hand, Rabbi Yossi says that a Sone is executed. Wow. So that means Reuven accidentally killed Shimon. So let's just understand, right? Reuven's going ahead and walking down a ladder. Reuven falls off the ladder, falls onto Shimon and kills him. So the Tanakama holds Reuven's not going to go to Galus for that. But we're also not doing anything else to him. Rabbi Yossi holds we're actually going to execute Reuven for that. Wow. Why? Mipnei shehu kimuad. Ultimately, again, because Ruvain is considered to be forewarned, right? Why? Because since this real animosity exists, we view Ruvain as being ready to harm Shimon at the first opportunity. Therefore, he's considered to be warned. There's a hasra, and therefore, again, if he kills Shimon, he's actually executed for that. Wild, I will say. It's absolutely wild. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon says, Yesh sone gola, yesh sone shena gola. Sometimes an enemy is exiled. Sometimes an enemy is not exiled. For example, Zeaklal, kosher yachol lomar ledas harag in a gola. So we'll say it's very interesting. Rabbi Shimon says, essentially, we have to look at the circumstances. We have to look at the circumstances. If it's clear that it was an accident, then halacha l'maisa, there's galus. If there's any suffix about the accidental nature of events, then ultimately, he won't go to galus. Very interesting. So that's how it says the Gemara Rabbanon. So we'll say first thing we're going to deal with is the blind guy, right? So remember again, machlokes, does a blind man go to galus if he accidentally kills someone, right? Rabbi Yehuda says no. Rabbi Meir says yes. So Tana Rabbanon below Ra'os, right? So we'll say it's very interesting. So the pasuk, when it talks about it, says b'chol aven asher yamos ba below Ra'os. So we'll say when it talks about the accidental killer, it says he didn't see. Now, Bepashas, what does it mean he didn't see? He wasn't aware, right? He wasn't aware, right? So remember again, Ruvain's chopping wood, a splinter flies off, kills Shimon. He didn't see Shimon in the vicinity. He didn't see him. But now listen to the Gemara Dash, below Rose, Prat Lusum de Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda understands this literally, that someone without sight doesn't go to Galus. This is Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir below Rose, the Rabbi says Hasuma. Rabbi Meir says, no, below Rose comes to actually include a blind person, right? Even someone who is below Ra'os, ultimately, again, goes to Galus. Fundamental machlokes. My time is Rabbi Yehuda. What's Rabbi Yehuda's logic? Right? So remember again, the pasuk sounds like Reuven and Shimon come into the forest. So the Gemara says, Afilu suma, right? Afilu suma, even a blind person. I asa below Ra'os. So remember again, essentially, like Ya'ar is like a riboy, anyone who comes into the forest. Then it says below Ra'os, without sight. So the Gemara says Mi'ate. Ultimately, it comes to exclude Suma. Right? So this is Rabbi Yehuda's logic, right? So Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, Suma is excluded. Ya'ar comes to include everyone, and then below Ra'os comes to exclude a blind person. Okay, Rabbi Meir says, below Ra'os lemait, so below Ra'os comes to exclude a suma, right? Bivli da'as lemait, without intent, is also a miyut. What is this? Have miyut achar miyut. It's one exclusionary phrase after another. And we'll say, what's the halacha miyut achar miyut? One of the exegetical principles. What's miyut achar miyut? Miyut achar miyut el rabos, right? A miyut after another. Miyut only comes to include. What does it come to include? Ultimately, again, a suma, and that is the position ultimately again of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda, Bivli das prat l'miskavinu das. Rabbi Yehuda will say, no, Bivli das comes to exclude something else, comes to exclude someone with intention. So both say, so therefore this is our machlokes. Is a suma exiled for accidentally killing someone else? We'll say that Rambam Paskins, like Rabbi Yehuda, a blind person does not go to Galus. Right? So if Reuven is blind and he accidentally kills Shimon, halacha l'maisa, not sent to Galus. First white line, Rabbi Yossi Omer Asone Nerag. So Rabbi Yossi is very interesting. Remember, Rabbi Yossi says, if Reuven hates Shimon, and then Reuven accidentally kills Shimon, so what's the halacha? Rabbi Yossi says Reuven is executed. Why? Because Reuven is considered to be forewarned. So the Gemara says, "Vaha lo asru." But 1 second, but he didn't get asra. You could say it's like he's been forewarned. That's very nice, but he didn't get asra. He didn't get asra. He executed that asra. Masnisin Rabbi Yossi Yehuda. He disnan Rabbi Yossi Yehuda Omer Chaver. Ein sarech hasra. So I'll say, you can remember again, Rabbi Yossi Yehuda holds that a Talmid Chacham doesn't require hasra. Why? Lefi shlo nitna hasra el hafkin bein shogeg umezid. So what are we talking about over here? We're talking about where Reuven, the guy who hates Shimon, is a Talmid Chacham. He's a Talmid Chacham. So because he's a Talmid Chacham, ultimately what? He doesn't require hasra. So because he doesn't require hasra, therefore when he ends up killing Shimon, we view it as an premeditated act, and therefore he's going to be executed. Which I will say, by the way, tells you something amazing. How could it be that you have a Talmid Chacham who hates another Yid? How could that be? It's very simple. Because just because you have a lot of Torah knowledge doesn't mean you have midos. Doesn't mean you have two midos. Those are two different buckets. It'd be very nice to think that the more Torah you have, the more midos you have. But unfortunately, again, we do tend to see this life bifurcation. That just because, right, remember we'll say, it's easy to acquire Torah knowledge. It really is. It really is. For the simple reason, learning Torah is incredible. It's fantastic. It's enjoyable. So to go ahead and soak this in, great. You could be a bad person and acquire a lot of Torah. The goal is that Torah changes me, right? The goal is that Torah refines me. But unfortunately, some people live with cognitive dissonance. And in that state of cognitive dissonance, I acquire a tremendous amount of knowledge, but I don't allow it to penetrate deeply enough to change me as a human being. So you could have a Talmid Chacham who is a Soneh. And I both say, that's the most dangerous thing. That's the most dangerous like state of being. Because a person thinks they're righteous because they have a lot of Torah, but they are utterly bankrupt in the world of midos. And because of that, but they don't even realize it, because they think they have all this Torah, so they think of themselves as righteous and pious, because look at me, I have this Torah. So we have to be so careful about this as well, to be the kind of people who have to allow Torah to sink deep enough inside of you, that ultimately, again, it changes my midos as well, and to recognize that even with all of the Torah, no matter how much you learn, you have to simultaneously work on your midos as well. They don't automatically occur in perfect harmony. I have to be working on my Torah, I have to be working on my midos. So as the Chas V'Shalom never become a Talmid Chacham Soneh. Incredible, incredible. So what says? Rabbi Shimon says, Yesh Soneh Gola. Rabbi Shimon says that again. Rabbi Shimon is in the Mishnah saying it really depends on the circumstances, right? In other words, that we kind of look at what happened over here. Does it look like an accent? Not look like an accent? And based on that, well, I tell you, case Rabbi Shimon, Yesh Soneh Gola, Yesh Soneh Gola. Listen to this: Nifsak Gola, Nishmat Ina Gola. So very simple. Rabbi say, right? Reuven hates Shimon. Right, Reuven hates Shimon, and he makes no secret about that he hates him. So what happened? So Reuven is hoisting up a bucket, and Shimon is sitting underneath the bucket. So if Reuven's pulling it up, right, and then suddenly, miraculously, right, it drops out of his hands, right? Nifsak Gola. So for example, if the rope breaks, then ultimately, again, that's an accident. That's a rope snap. That's an accident, and therefore, again, Reuven will go to Galus. If the rope didn't snap, but somehow Reuven lost his grip and the bucket fell on Shimon, that doesn't look like an accident. And therefore, again, that won't get Galus. That time, Rabbi Shimon says, the Olam Eino Gola, Ad Sheyishmat Machatzala Biado. Right? The Gemara says, but 1 second. But Rabbi Shimon says elsewhere that he doesn't get Galus up until literally, again, the rope slips from his hand. So the Gemara says, Kasha Nifsak Nifsak. Kasha nishmat nishmat. What's the contradiction? To which the Gemara said, nifsak lo kasha. So the case of the snapping of the rope, we'll say, is not a contradiction. Haba ohev. One is when they're friends. And we'll say, by the way, ohev doesn't have to literally mean they're friends. Just what does ohev mean? What does ohev mean? They're not enemies, right? They're not enemies. We'll say, which, by the way, is a tremendous yisod. V'yahavta l're'acha kamocha. Right? What does it mean, I will say? And again, it's probably the mitzvah that we struggle with most. What is Yazrecha Kamocha? Love your fellow like you love yourself. Impossible. Impossible. I can't love every single Jew. For the simple reason I will say, even if I want to, let's be honest. There are some people who are simply unlovable. Right? There are some people, you might be related to some of them also, right? In other words, there are some people who are simply unlovable. Like they're not nice. They're not good. They're really not. Like I will say, not everybody is good. So what do you do with this? You see something amazing. All you need to do is not hate people, right? In other words, if you notice, by the way, ha'ohev. How do Chazal define an ohev? Someone you love? Someone who you love is simply what? Someone who you don't hate, right? The goal within Klal Yisrael is don't harbor animosity. Okay, if you could get to the level of loving every Jew, like Rabbi Yitzchak Berditchev, Zechusa Yagin, the Rebbe, right, was a tremendous, he literally loved every single Yid. Incredible. Tavalach bracha. Fantastic. But for most of us who are not going to get to the level of Rabbi Yitzchak Berditchev, the Gemara says, by the way, as long as you don't hate someone, that's an ohev. V'ahavta l're'acha kamocha simply means don't harbor animosity against another Jew. That's it. That's it. I will say that all of us could do. That all of us could do. There's not one, okay, to love everyone, to love everyone like I love myself. Okay, that's Rabbi Yitzchak, that's Rabbi Akiva, that's Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Even Moshe Rabbeinu, right, had his tipping point by Korach, like we saw in Sanhedrin, right? Fine. But at least I will say, not to harbor animosity, so as long as you don't hate someone, he's called an Ohev. Sa'aba Ohev, right? So again, I will say, if halacha l'maisa, if the rope snaps, ultimately again, if it's someone who I don't hate, galus, habasone, but ultimately, again, if it was an enemy, then there's no galus. Nishmat and nishmat lo kasha. Assuming again, if the rope slips out of my hand, it's also not a contradiction. So the Gemara says, Rabbi v'harabanan. Ultimately, again, one is reflecting the view of Rabbi, that's the Einagola, and one is reflecting the view of the Rabbanon. Okay, I will say good. Next Mishnah. I will say now we're starting a very, very exciting sugya. I mean, this has all been very exciting. So let's go back there. Lehechan Golin. So we'll say it's interesting. So, by the way, it's fascinating. We've been speaking about Gullus this whole time. By the way, where exactly are we going in Gullus? To where are we being exiled? Actually, we'll say, you know what? Well, how far in am I already? All right, let me start the Mishnah. Lehechan Golin. It's a long daf tomorrow. Lehechan Golin, right? So to where exactly does exile occur? La'ari Miklat, to an air Miklat, a city of refuge. What about these cities of refuge? So the Gemara says. So the Gemara, you know what, we're going to start with for today. We're going to pick up with the Mishnah tomorrow. Mirat Hashem. It's a whole sugi by itself. Pick up the Mishnah tomorrow. We'll say tremendous shkoyach, everyone. Shkoyach. All right, Chevra Zoom, have a great day, everyone.